It is one of the sessions of a series of panel discussions that our association, The Bridge, started last spring with the support of an NGO from the Balkans and for the Balkans. And then now with the support of the Regional Cooperation Council. So yes, we started with their support, and now we are going on with the support of the agency of the Albanian NGO agency for the support of civil society. This is the sixth panel that we are organizing. And we have to thank also the International Association of Students for Economical Science and Commerce, who are supporting us, are helping us with the audience, with the contacts and everything. Now, the present session is about the welfare state and youth, or social justice and youth, and awareness and action. So this is a very complex. Awareness and activism, youth activism. This is a very complex issue. It's quite complex because the youth can be the beneficiary of social justice, or if social justice is lacking, it is the group that is among the most vulnerable groups. But on the other hand, it is not an object only of the welfare state, but it is a subject that can promote the welfare state by its activism and by its awareness. So this topic can be approached from many angles, from different angles, and being it quite complex, therefore we have two very special guests who are the panelists, Lea Ypi and Delina Fico. I will not go through their profiles because everybody who is following us know it already due to the dissemination made by the International Association of Students that I mentioned. I would only add that Delina Fico, being a leader, civil society activist leader, her activity has been not only in Albania, but also it has been important in Kosovo and the United States. And for Lea Ypi, I would add that she studied in the Università La Sapienza in Rome. She started there studying philosophy. Then she has been to Sorbonne. She has been to the Frankfurt School, which is among the most important schools for social sciences at global level. And also she studied in Britain, and now, as you know, she's teaching political theory at London School of Economic and Political Sciences. She went there when she left Albania when she was 17. Another thing I would mention is that she comes from a persecuted family, but untypically, she is a left-wing thinker. This is something untypical in Albania. So now I will leave the floor first to Lea Ypi. So Lea, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Boshkin, for this invitation. Maybe I'll start by saying something about the untypical part of what you said, because I think it might help frame the discussion slightly differently in Albania and in general in post-communist societies. I know one of the most common perceptions of people who are on the left coming from post-communist contexts is that because the context is post-communist, they should be automatically on the right. But I think that does an injustice to the history of the left in these countries, which has been as much persecuted by the left in power as the right. And so I think it's really one of the reasons that I want to claim and vindicate the left label is exactly to try and do justice and to bring to the surface some of the historical questions that have to do with the development of the left in countries like Albania historically, in hope that if we have a more nuanced historical awareness of political activism, we benefit not just in our understanding of the past, but also in terms of orienting our actions in the present. So that's the kind of general premise about me and my profile. What I wanted to talk about in approaching the issue of the panel, which is youth and youth activism in Albania and Balkans, and I guess generally post-communist context, is that whenever I'm asked about what I think about these questions in Albania, my one line sort of simplified answer is that the problems of Albania, also when it came to youth activism, used to be just the problems of Albania, and now they are the problems of the world. And so the things that we think about and reflect and the repercussions that we feel are repercussions that come to our country and to our region from a global context and also from the conflicts that shape that global context, which is also partly why my work to date has been mostly, even though it's been connected to Albania and to the Balkans and to post-communist societies more generally, it's been more on trying to work out what is it about the global context that affects the societies like ours. So I wanted to talk mainly about two things. One, the relationship between youth policy and migration, and the second one, youth or sort of youth activism, youth policy and migration. The second one, youth activism and political commitment more generally, because one of the things that is often framed and presented as a problem in these societies is actually emigration and the question of youth and the young people just abandoning their country. And one of my, in recent years, both immigration and emigration has been at the center of political campaign and public debate in a lot of wealthy democracies, and but also in developing countries, and where the left and the right are kind of divided on how to tackle the question. But the common sense response to the question, and also when it comes to how it affects young people, is actually to leave the question as it is, as a question. In other words, not to challenge the framing of the question. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that we have when we talk about migration, both from the perspective of sending societies like Albania and from the perspective of receiving societies, which is that it's framed as a problem when in fact it's not a problem. It's only a problem in the context of global injustices and regional power asymmetries and asymmetric distribution of opportunities and resources and including opportunities for political activism. So actually, if we look at migration globally speaking in terms of numbers and flows, the data generally suggests that while the number of people living outside the country of birth has been increasing in absolute terms, this is in line with the rise of global population and so proportional to flows in the past. And if you look at the contribution of migrants in receiving societies, then there is not a lot of evidence to suggest that migrants are a burden in absolute terms. And if you think of the question of migration from the point of view of sending societies, you also need to be very careful with the data, because it's not just the absolute numbers of people who migrate who leave, but you also need to account for the phenomenon of return migration and so circular migration. So the question is that migration only becomes a problem if people who leave their country never return or don't return in any form. And yet, migration is still invoked as a problem in political discourse. And I think the reason it's invoked as a problem is political, not cultural or demographic. And again, I think the way it's presented both in receiving and sending societies is very, very similar, because what you have is often a kind of nationalist right that in receiving societies says, look, there's a problem because we have too many migrants coming, and this is changing the ethnic composition of receiving societies, it's changing political opportunities, it's changing, the capacity of the welfare state, to the extent that there is a welfare state, to respond to challenges. And so the pressure from the right is to reduce the numbers of migrants. The pressure in sending societies is from, again, also a kind of nationalist right that points to the question of depopulation, and so says, look, our country is losing workforce and it's losing people, and it's also losing its identity somehow. So I think the question, however, is not really to do with migration as such, but is only a problem insofar as the question of migration is kind of inserted in a structure of political opportunities and distribution of resources more generally. And so, and from a historical perspective, there really isn't anything particularly new in the way in which migration is instrumentalized and weaponized in both these societies, because whenever historically there has been a crisis of the welfare state or of social justice or the ability of the state to deliver social justice, the debate has always shifted on the question of migration. And in the Balkans and in post-communist context, this looks a little bit different because the pressure is on why are people leaving. In receiving societies like advanced liberal democracies, so Britain, France, Germany, and so on, it's about why do we have so many migrants coming? And often the question is presented as a dilemma, but it seems to me that there is no way out of that dilemma that can be a win-win solution for both countries, because in the case of receiving societies, what you need and what is often said is you need people who are young and able to contribute and who have skills and who can actually raise the levels of contribution to the welfare state. But anything that is beneficial to receiving societies is actually a loss from the point of view of sending societies. Because if you say that from the point of view of France and Germany and England, it makes sense to have highly skilled migrants, young, productive, in an age where they can actually contribute to society, this is exactly the kind of migration that sending societies can't really afford to lose. And so it's a kind of migration that hurts sending societies. So it seems to me that when you're thinking about kind of how to handle this problem of migration, and especially migration as it affects young people in the Balkans, it's very hard to expect solutions that come institutionally from international institutions, because to the extent that these international institutions are affected and subject to these power asymmetries, and to the extent that they are shaped by the preferences of dominant countries, it's actually very unlikely that they will contribute. And it's very likely that they will encourage, for example, as I said, a specific kind of migrant who is wealthy or who has contributing capacities, and it will discourage a certain kind of migrant. And exactly what will be encouraged from the point of view of developed states will be harmful from the point of view of sending states. So I think the question of migration is a good lens from which to approach this problem of youth in developing countries, because, as I say, on the one hand, it's presented as a problem, but on the other hand, there is no solution to the problem that can afford to leave the problem as such. You need to get out of the logic of migration and to ask yourself, what is it that is structurally missing in both the societies, and how is it that politics needs to change to move things forward in a different direction? And that requires no longer framing migration as a problem, either as emigration or as immigration. So it requires tackling migration, I think, as part of a phenomenon that is more revealing about the phenomenon than as a problem of injustice itself. So I think it only makes sense to speak of youth migration, for example, as a problem if we link youth migration to questions of development more generally. So the next question I think that I wanted to speak about and that needs to be raised is, why is it that there is this migration? And again, I think there are certain countries that are more vulnerable to migration, even if the data look quite similar. So there is a sense in which people leaving a certain context there is a kind of ideological factor that plays a role, and a sense of how do they connect to trust in political institutions of these states that explains why is it that these states are more vulnerable to migration pressure. And I think one of the reasons in a post-communist context has to do really with the way in which the transition has affected the sense of self and the capacity to believe in a kind of social contract between the citizens and the states. So one of the implications of both the way in which communism has fallen in these societies and of the kinds of policies that had been put in place after the fall of communism has led to an erosion of the state and to the erosion of belief in the capacity of the state to be a vehicle for social change. So that means that if the social contract is perceived to be broken, if society isn't really seen in its relationship to the state as able to deliver the kinds of responses that young people wanted to deliver, then you don't have an incentive to stay in that society. The incentive is to leave society, and so to just go and look for alternatives elsewhere, which again, I think is a mirage, because there are no solutions that can be beneficial to both contexts. So it's a world that I think thrives on these global power asymmetries and the asymmetries in the distribution of wealth and of resources. And so I think migration is a symptom of the crisis of the world, and the fact that people look for answers in this phenomenon that only gives a kind of illusionary response signals to us something really important about the collapse of faith in state institutions and the collapse in our collective capacity to remedy these institutions. And I think this is the second topic that I wanted to maybe raise in connection to this, starting with the migration in inverted commas as a potential problem, is the question of political agency. So I think migration becomes an issue when it's as I say, the symptom of a crisis of belief in political agency. And there is a collapse of belief in political agency across societies in the world. So it doesn't matter whether it's the Balkans or Albania or Eastern Europe or Western Europe. In general, we see a massive detachment of citizens from political institutions and a sense of disbelief and political disenchantment and lack of trust that if I become active, if I'm involved, then I will be able to change things in the society in which I live. And for countries like Albania and other post-communist countries who come from this past of isolation, it's very easy to think that if I just leave the country, then I will find the kinds of opportunities for political agency that you lacked in your own context. Of course, in Western countries that don't have this history of isolation, it becomes much more difficult and doesn't necessarily reflect in migration as in exiting society, but it's revealed in other pathologies. So lack of participation, lack of belief in political parties, lack of engagement in social issues and social activism more generally. And again, I think this is something that you experience across the spectrum and across the world. So it's not about Eastern Europe versus Western Europe. It's just that in Eastern Europe, it takes the form of migration. In Western Europe, it takes the form of different kinds of pathologies. So why has that happened? I think it has to do with a change in the way in which, especially political parties on the left, have been unable to engage with citizens. And I think, Bashkim, you were mentioning at the beginning of your remarks this connection between the youth as both the recipient of social welfare state measures, but also the initiator of social welfare state measures. And it's clear that in the last 2 decades, basically, left-wing political parties and the kinds of parties that are mobilized in favor of social justice goals have been completely disconnected from civil society and also from this emancipatory agenda and framework that orients civil society, that has traditionally oriented civil society. And what we have seen is a complete divide where on the one hand you have movements in favor of social justice, which are the ones that gather youth participation and youth activism, but without really making a claim or an effort to share power. And so without really trying to be an alternative government on the one hand, so what I call the kind of the left of the squares and the protests and the no globals and so on, and the Occupy Wall Street or whatever in the West. But I think also in probably in Eastern European context as well, you see a kind of social movement left that begins to emerge, but is really unable to access power and doesn't even want to become really a party that wants to be institutionally represented. So it's usually just a question of activism and social movements. And on the other hand, you have political parties that have become more like cartel parties. So parties that tend to concentrate around the center and that rule in a very technocratic way. And so with the invoking experts or scientists or administrators, and there's this sense that actually there isn't really a lot of ideological difference between these parties, because when they come to govern, when they create policies, the policies are very similar and they're all concentrated around the center. So what you see is a question of left-wing or traditionally social justice active parties that have actually stopped being campaigning for social justice in connection to social movements and have just gone down the route of institutional representation and down the effort of winning elections. So I think what we have is, what young people are confronted with is a choice of either being co-opted by mainstream parties and becoming part of political institutions and running institutions in this very technocratic way, with the help of, as I say, a series of compromises with economic elite, cultural elites, and so on. Or on the other hand, being active at the level of social movements, but unable to actually make governmental change or to make any change that results into real policy change, because it mainly takes the form of political activism that is oppositional and insurrectional, but doesn't really find expression. And I think, to me, that points sort of theoretically and from a wider perspective, it's not a question of, how can the youth become more trusting of politicians, or how can the youth kind of motivate itself to believe in certain things that it doesn't believe in. It's a question of the incentive systems that you find in the political structure of the context. And that requires rethinking representation, both as civil society representation and as political party representation. So what we need, I think, is a return to party competition or party contest or party even just exchange or debate of ideas, where there is really more of an exchange on matters of principle rather than, who did this, who did what, who is corrupt, who stole this, who stole that. Because what you have right now is a debate where you don't have any kind of engagement between political parties on matters of principle and substance and policy that is justified or backed by any kind of vision. What you have is these very, very petty disputes that are unable to let young people orient themselves in terms of, okay, what do I believe about society? What does justice require? And to channel their beliefs in a way that is organized politically. So to me, political parties are really important vehicles for political engagement. They're really the tools through which the claims of civil society become governmental policy and become laws and become influential and really have a chance of succeeding by claiming a share in government. But on the other hand, because of the way in which the political party debate takes place, and again, this is across the world, it's not about Albania or the Balkans or Western Europe. I think there's something about the development of political parties in the last 2-3 decades that has led to this position where there really is no principled competition between parties anymore, and where parties are no longer ideologically organized, they're no longer presenting visions for social change, they're no longer really aspiring to move the agenda forward, and where that job is left just to civil society, but to a kind of civil society activism that seems to be increasingly isolated from the claims of political institutions and from the claims of representative institutions. So to me, the first thing we need to think about is how to reconnect the party structure, the political party structure, with civil society activism, but also how to renew the political party structure in a way that can deliver, given the kinds of global challenges that all political parties face and that they can't resolve just within their nation state. So you need to both open up from inside in terms of making parties more fluid and more open to the claims of civil society, but also from the outside in terms of being able to coordinate the agenda of progressive parties more generally. And I think when it comes to, and this is really my last remark, when it comes to youth activism, this is really important, because I think we are at a stage where younger people are much more aware of the fact that the challenges that we face are global challenges. So young people aren't really in this kind of isolationist mode of thinking about problems. They're usually very aware of the fact that, yes, you live in a particular context. Yes, there are specific challenges of that context that make it, the challenges of Albania are different from those of North Macedonia, different from Serbia, and so on. But on the other hand, we are also, all countries are subject to these global political and economic and cultural pressures, which required coordinated solutions. And, the environmental case is one example. If you look at the trends of political parties that are environmentally conscientious and sort of green activism and so on, this is the type of activism that mostly attracts young people right now. Why does it attract them? Because they realize it's about them, it's about future generations. They realize there's something that they can all connect to each other because it's transnational, you know, it's the environment doesn't belong to any particular state, and because it gives them a way of thinking about the future that is in some ways grounded on politics. You know, what decisions you make today about the environment are directly relevant to your identity as a young person that is not just limited to living in Albania or wherever. So I think the fact that there is sensitivity around environmental questions is really important to connect these kind of struggles and to connect these social justice movements around the world. But what is missing is the capacity, as I say, of existing political institutions and the mechanisms of coordination through which political institutions operate both globally and locally to really be able to channel the claims of younger generations and to turn these forms of isolated or piecemeal or purely oppositional political activism into a kind of constructive agenda that can motivate younger people to regain the trust they need in political institutions and the trust they need to see the state as a kind of compact and as a collective that acts together and engages, rather than as something that is just an obstacle to you and to your personal development and that you just need to leave behind by moving to another place where you actually will end up finding exactly the same kinds of problems. So I used to have this joke about, you know, what does it mean to be a migrant? It means to sample different kinds of state failure. And unfortunately, if we don't kind of get out of that way of thinking about migration, political membership, boundaries, the connection between local and global struggles, I think we will be in a very paradoxical place when it comes to motivating youth activism, and also in a place that I don't think is very productive and constructive in terms of how to take it forward. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah, very much, and for your presentation, for this rich panorama that you deployed. Now I will, the questions will come at the end, question and answers with the audience. Now I will leave the floor to Delina. I would also mention about her, then she started, she has studied literature, so this is her academic formation, and then later she entered into the civic activism. Now, Delina, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Bashkin. Thanks, Leah, for this very interesting and challenging presentation. So, Leah is an academic, and she teaches at London School of Economics, and I'm a practitioner. I am a women's rights activist and a human rights activist from Albania, but I have also worked and lived in other countries, including the US and in Kosovo. And I thought this time I'm going to take, Leah laid out all the challenges to youth activism and to youth engagement. And I will actually talk about two examples of youth actually acting as actors of social change, even in a difficult society like Albania. Bashkim, could you please allow me to share the screen? Can you make me the host for the moment?
Yes, I will ask the host.
And I wanted to say, yes, I studied linguistics and literature in Albania, but then I also studied nonprofit management and political science from the New School in New York. So I'm one of those people that has changed careers several times until I found my calling, which was a work related to activism.
Hi, Aladdin. Delina wants to make a PowerPoint presentation. Can you do it? Okay, thank you.
She has to make me the host.
Sorry,
so that I can share.
You can share your screen. Down of your page, you can see share screen.
Yes, I can. Yeah, now I can share. Okay, you can see my screen, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So, so I am both an activist, and I continue to be an activist as a volunteer. but I also work from the other side of supporting civic engagement in the world, because I work with international development programs in various countries of the world. I've worked in Georgia, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Uganda, Zimbabwe, and some other countries. Anyway, but my presentation today is focused on Albania, and it's a very interesting case, because, and I will just take two examples, which I think are significant. The first one is the role of youth in basically launching the movement and making progress on LGBTIQ persons' rights in Albania. And I will give a little bit of context. Until 1995, and during the dictatorship in Albania, homosexuality was a crime prescribed for in the criminal code, and it was punishable by 10 years in prison. In 1995, it was decriminalized. And in 1993, the first ever organization of actually gay men was established. But for the first decades, or the first 15 years of Albania's transition to democracy, basically this was LGBTI people's rights were more or less a taboo, or the very few times when things were discussed, it was actually either tinted by a homophobic perspective, or was presented in a distorted way. For example, just to give you an example of how bad things were, I remember I mean, from the early 90s, I got active with women's rights movement in Albania, and then I came back from some conference abroad, and I had met there a lesbians group, and they said to me, well, if there is a lesbians group in Albania, can you please give them these materials? And I met in the street a journalist, a well-known journalist, and he had interviewed one of the gay persons in Albania, but hiding his name, and this was a printed interview. And so I said to the journalist, I said, well, because you contacted these people, probably they have contacts also with lesbian groups, and can you give them this material? And this journalist was so upset, and he said, why are you asking me this? Do you think I'm homosexual? I'm like, no, I just, and it's okay if you're homosexual. I just thought because you have contacted them. So it was that bad. And so people, even the members of this first organization, after a couple of years, they worked in hiding, and then after a couple of years, most of them migrated because they just couldn't live their lives here. And the police, especially, was harsh with transgender people who were actually working as sex workers in the center of Tirana. And then very interesting story, like two young people came along. Their names are Jenny Kara and Christy Pinderi, and they were 23 years old. Jenny was 23 years old in 2009. And at that time, in the mid 2000s, there was some initial discussion about LGBTI rights. For example, I remember a conference on human rights, and there was this one small section on LGBTI rights, and I remember there was this police, this representative of the police there, and he said, "Oh, we don't hate them, we just don't like them," which was horrible. But it also showed how ignorant he was about the LGBTI community and their rights and what they represent in the society. And at that time in Albania, we had a U.S. ambassador who was very progressive, and he was a PhD person, and I mean a person with PhD, sophisticated person. And there was a couple of lesbian women working at the embassy, and they were trying to connect to the LGBTI community in Albania, and there was no community. And then they met Jenny and Christy, and that was the beginning of the movement. again, to show you how bad things were, this couple, this lesbian couple, American lesbian couple, they had a child, and they had a babysitter, an Albanian babysitter who was like 35 years old. And only after this lesbian couple started working with Jenny and Christy and the other small group of activists, only then the babysitter came out to them and she said, I'm lesbian, I'm living with my partner, but people think we are friends. So she was, this babysitter, she was so scared that she couldn't even tell the American lesbian couple that she was serving. And Jenny and Christy and a very small group of activists who were all in their mid-20s, they first of all, they began building a community. Their first activities were like parties mixed with like awareness raising sessions, just to make people to come together. And initially, this was like meeting in a bar, which was in a kind of protected area. I mean, the Albanians will know, but the embassy, what's called the embassy street, where there's police and there isn't much traffic, so that people felt safe. And that was the time when I met them, and I have been from the beginning a supporter of LGBTIQ rights in Albania. And then they undertook the first civic actions, and I recall the first thing they did is like they prepared a poster that says "To be gay is not a disease," and this was supposed to encourage LGBTI persons to just come out and meet this group of activists and also not feel horrible about themselves. And they just distributed it in the nights in the center of Tirana. I mean, it looks simple now, but if you talk to the activists, they were shit scared at that time because they didn't know what the police would do, what the people would do. So they took the right approach, because they didn't jump into setting up organizations or looking for funding. At the beginning, they took their time to build a community of the LGBTI persons in Albania, but also a community of supporters of their rights. And then from that time on, they moved to setting up organizations. There are three main organizations that represent the LGBTIQ community in Albania. And then in 2014, we had the first Tirana Pride, and it was a rainy day. It went overall well, although there were some people that were taking the protesters not with guns, not with stones, but there is this thing which is like firecrackers, just to scare them away. And since then, the organizations have grown, the activities have grown. And this is, for example, a picture of Tirana Pride in 2023. At the end, I will give you some links if you want to learn more about the movement and see more pictures. You can look at those links. And so, due to the activism of this group of young people and their supporters, as well as due to the support of the international community in Albania, it's true to say that a quiet revolution has happened in Albania in the last 15 years in terms of LGBTIQ rights. So we have an anti-discrimination law, an anti-discrimination commissioner that function. There are national plans on LGBTI persons' rights. There's been tremendous work done by the community to educate the police, the teachers, the social workers about LGBTI rights and their needs and how they can serve them. And so now we have a completely different picture, from police that used to beat transgender people in the streets in 2005 to police actually that most of the time are very supportive of the work of the community and try to help when they can. We also piloted in Albania the shelter for LGBTI persons, which was the first in the Balkans, And there are legal and psychosocial support services provided by one of the leading organizations, which is the Alliance Against the Discrimination of LGBTI persons in Albania. What is interesting also is that a segment of the LGBTIQ movement in Albania has also made a contribution to a stronger feminist movement in Albania. I mean, you are all young, but people who've been active with women's rights movements in Eastern and Central Europe will know that although there are groups who say the right things and do the right work, they wouldn't identify as feminist groups. And these younger people, both within the women's movement and the LGBTIQ rights movement, have actually strengthened the feminist aspect of the women's rights movement, and that has benefited the movement. So I don't want to. I said there's been a revolution. I don't want to paint a rosy picture. I'm just saying that due to youth activism, we moved from the dark ages to a struggle for LGBTI rights with some progress made. But homophobia is widespread. There are insufficient services to protect people from young people from bullying and discrimination, and also to support, for example, the transgender community. There's a lack of regulatory framework related to civil unions or same-sex marriage, or the right to adopt children for same-sex couples and things like that. So the struggle goes on, but youth activists have really made a change in Albania for an important part of the society here, and in the process they have educated segments of the society and segments of the public institutions. So here are some links to some document. There's this one documentary film Scandal, which an Albanian can read as a scandal, but it can also read "We're not stopping." There's no stopping. It gives you a good idea about the history of the movement in the last basically, so 2009, 2023, it's like 14 years. Do you want me to put this in Bashkim in the chat, or do you want me to send the PowerPoint presentation and you can send it out to people?
Yes.
In the chat?
No, well, I don't know about how they can do it, the audience, but you can send them to me and we will distribute.
Okay.
It. Don't worry.
Okay. Sorry, I need to go back. Sorry. Bear with me. So then I will talk more briefly about. I mean, I'm intimately aware of the LGBTIQ persons movement in Albania. I will enter a little bit Leah's territory here, because I'll talk a little bit about the role of youth in another interesting movement in Albania, which I don't even have the right, I think, vocabulary to name, but I will just call it the left-wing movement. So I'll give a little bit of context here. When Albanians, when political changes started to take place in Albania in 1990 and 1991, Albanians in general undertook a wholesale or holistic rejection of everything of the past. So differently also from some other countries in Eastern and Central Europe and even in Southeastern Europe, the Albanian transition to free market and democracy has very, to my opinion, has very much been going in the center and right-wing direction. So overall, the political parties, the public discourse, public policy in Albania in the last 30 years, it's very much center and center-right, even for parties like the Socialist Party in power that pretend to be left-leaning. I mean, this is a sweeping generalization, and as all sweeping generalizations, it runs the risk to be oversimplifying. But overall, and for example, just to make a simple example, for example, it's in a way ridiculous that for Albania the model of development has been the United States. While the United States is very far from Albania, it's a federal state, it's a continent, and not say France or Denmark, you know, or any European country, because of this, I think, not just the political parties, but also the public at large, this kind of center-right leaning. We also have suffered, and I think we continue to suffer from a weak trade union. So we have missed in Albania a genuine, clear-sighted left-wing movement. And so in the midst of this vacuum, I would say, in 2011, a small group of people got together, and these were young people and some of their professors. And they got together after a particular dark moment in Albanian political history, where there was a peaceful protest, and then the police killed 4 protesters who were not armed and were not attacking the police. And the movement, this event brought together students and professors with this big desire of social justice, which they felt was missing. This discussion and this effort for social justice was missing from the public debate in Albania. I mean, just to frame them ideologically, some of their the people that they admire and venerate are people like Antonio Gramsci or Karl Marx or Che Guevara. So just to frame them in a very simplified way. I don't personally 100% agree with them, and they might not see me as a friend. So, but I like their focus on issues that are not very broadly discussed and highlighted in Albanian political debate and in policy making in Albania, which is this the workers' rights, social justice, environmental protection. They have made a contribution to bringing up these issues in more to the public attention, and they have grown in the process. I mean, they have now grown from a small organization to some kind of movement. For example, they played a key role on what's called the Movement for the University, which was a students' movement that was opposed to the government's changes to the higher education law, and the political organization played a key role in leading it. And then in the last local elections in Albania, they actually came together as a political organization, and they presented a candidate for a mayor for the capital, Tirana, and he won nearly 5% of the vote, which is a very good result, taking consideration that one of the 2 candidates of one of the main opposition parties, the Democratic Party, actually got less than the candidate of the movement of the political organization movement, which was called the movement, the Together movement. I mean, critics of the organizational or political organization, they think that these are this is a group of people and they don't have broad support. They work only with an oppositional agenda, and they're not constructive. Sometimes there are also criticism about them being sectarian in terms of who they invite to join them, or who do they work with, and who do they cooperate with. But I just wanted to bring this as an example of another contribution that youth have given to social change in Albania, because both probably the LGBTIQ rights movement in Albania has changed things in a major way, but I think also the political organization and the people that support them have made a contribution and a significant contribution to the public discourse and political discourse in Albania. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Delina, for your presentation. Very interesting. Thank you so much. I would like, for starting with the question, I would like to highlight the fact that both of you focused on marginal groups or vulnerable groups, like immigrants in Lea's presentation and the LGBT in Delina's presentation. They may seem marginal, not representing the majority of the society or the majority of the popular classes, but the marginal at the margin sometimes is found the truth also for the majority. We can see there somehow magnified the problems of everybody. Now let's go to the public and for the questions they might have for both of you. We have roughly half an hour time. So nobody's having any question? Okay. Justice Anthony, please.
Okay, good day. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, cool, awesome. So first of all, I would say thank you for this space, very insightful so far. So my name is Justice Anthony, and I'm currently the president of ISEC in Albania. So my question is directed at Leah first. I think I have two questions. So my first question is, when you were explaining, for you, Leah, when you were explaining, you talked about the fact that the role of immigrant in the receiving society is sometimes not really discussed enough. And if you think about the UK society, majority of what you notice so far in the news is that make it seem like the immigrants who go there, they are more or less not contributing to the country in a very positive manner. But if you look at the actual facts from like data insights, you see that majority of these guys, for example, they work in NHS, for example. So how do you like differentiate between the sentiment and the actual fact of what immigrants actually give to a receiving society, for example? That would be my first question.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to ask your second question as well, or shall I answer this one first?
That would be for Delina. The second question is for Delina, but just answer yours first, so there's alignment, I would say.
Yeah, that's fine. So I mean, you're right. All the data on immigration says that this is just a constructed phenomenon, that there isn't actually any reason to be worried because migrants on the whole contribute more than they claim from the state. And also because generally in receiving societies, the demographic trends are such that they benefit from a workforce that is younger and able to contribute. And so I think from a kind of scientific, empirical point of view, there is no concern. But what is also clear is that scaremongering about migrants makes a difference to how parties perform in elections. And so the discourse between the facts and the political manipulation of the discourse, there is a gap. And just pointing at the facts is not enough to close the gap, because insofar as it does play a role in public discourse, even if it's a lie, it doesn't matter because the lie becomes politically expedient and instrumental. So I think this is why I was saying that for me, one of the questions is the responsibility of especially parties on the left, to actually resist the framing of migration as a problem, because the problem starts with the framing. If you start thinking there is a problem with migration in these societies, then you're kind of losing, because then you have to explain, insofar to what extent it's not a problem. Then there's obviously a selection of facts to report can always be biased. And so in Britain, you see that headlines are completely dominated by, news about boats and so on. But when you have the other phenomenon, which is a boat that sinks in Greece, for example, as a result of the neglect and inaction of EU authorities and EU states like Greece, the attention that gets on the media is completely disproportionately small compared to the big attention that these, dozens of migrants who might be illegal and who also usually, even if they are illegal, have a reason for coming. And often the reason for coming is not disconnected from global politics and from actually geopolitics. So if you think about what are the centers of human smuggling in the Middle East, for example, these are countries that were completely destabilized with the help of European major states. So it's not the case that there is a question of us versus them, where the them have distinct problems that they're responsible for and the publics in Western countries are not responsible for. It's a complex global phenomenon, which unfortunately, framing as a problem of migration already obscures the basis for resolving it. You can only resolve it if you stop talking about migration. And for that, the parties who are only doing this instrumentally, because it's actually against their principles to even think about the question in those terms, have a huge responsibility. They should play catch with the parties who have an interest and also an ideology that serves this discourse. So this is why I think, for me, yes, on the one hand, the data helps, and it's important that it's different, and it's important that the facts so that migrants are not a burden and so on. But to me, if you're already engaging with the question of migrants as a burden and you're trying to resist it, I think you've already lost. It's like, when people say, when you're explaining, you're losing. If you're explaining on migration, you're losing, because you should just say, look, let's just reframe the discourse rather than engage with the terms of the debate as it is presented.
Now, Delina,
Okay,
there was a question for Delina by Justice, right?
Yes. I have a question for Delina. Thank you, Leah, for your answer. Very insightful. Thank you. So for you, Delina, my question is this. So I come from a country where it is illegal to be openly gay. It is 14 years imprisonment to be openly gay.
Which country is that, Anthony?
Nigeria.
Nigeria. Okay, because Uganda just passed a horrible anti-homosexuality law. Uganda also just passed a terrible law.
Yes, Africa is generally very, very much not in support of this LGBT community. So my question is this: in terms of like general acceptance now, for example, you talk about, when you explain, you talked about people saying that, oh, we are not against them, we just don't like them. That's like a very common sentiment I've noticed about the LGBT community. But there comes a certain part that also makes it seem like these guys, this community may not necessarily be helping yourself. There are like extreme parts, obviously extreme parts of any community, but there are extreme parts of the community that actually somehow obscures the more, I would say, more regular people in the LGBT community. So how would you recommend that they maybe work on the branding? Because right now it seems like the people who are on the extreme side are getting more limelight than those who are actually who's supposed to be promoting the LGBT community, to actually give them more say in the grand scheme of things, I would say.
Thanks, Justice. There is actually a kind of similar question in the chat by Ellen. Ellen is saying about LGBTI, don't you think that their activism is more like promoting theirs and force others to believe like them more than requesting their rights? First, I wanted to say, listen, these people suffer for real. I mean, being an LGBTIQ person in this world, in this time, in most of the world, it's a very hard life. Like, nobody would choose to have that life. Nobody would like to be discriminated, even by their own family. I mean, in countries like Nigeria or Uganda, you can go to prison. And why? Because you just love a different person. You know, I mean, like, why are you going to prison? So these people, like, the suffering and the violation of human rights of LGBTIQ persons is real, is very severe, and it really affects their lives. For example, to give you an example, suicide among LGBTIQ youth is much higher than other segments of youth. So we have, when we think about this community, we have to think about how much they suffer and why do they suffer. Only, I mean, you know what I say to people when there are people who want to learn more, I say, just do a very simple test, kind of folk type of test. If you are a heterosexual person and you are a woman, for example, and you are not interested sexually in a man, do you care who that man sleeps with? So the LGBTI community is discriminated for something that is very existential, has to do with their own identity that they cannot fight, and their rights are severely curtailed in most of the countries. Now, if you put yourself on the progressive side of the society, if you put yourself on those that defend human rights of all people, then you have to support them. And also, you cannot, because there are some people, I don't know, transgender or intersex people that somehow offend your sense of public order or offend your sense of rules or what's ethically or what's visually permissible. That should not be an excuse to throw them out or to ask them not to exist, because the society, the entire society, it is, I mean, it thrives on diversity. We are diverse. We are diverse by race, by language, by ethnicity, by age, by education, by social status, by religion, by everything. And so the same way you are tolerant of your very religious grandfather who goes to the church or the mosque every week, you should be not tolerant, but you should be respectful also of those segments of the LGBTIQ community that might be more vocal, more different in the way they express themselves. So there should be no excuse to join the chorus of those people who say LGBTIQ people, for example, there are people who don't like the Pride Parade. Like, what's wrong with the Pride Parade? You have in New York City, you have parades of Albanians and people from the Caribbean, and they are colorful and noisy the same way the Pride Parade is colorful and noisy. Why you don't get upset with the Caribbean or even what's the one in April, which is the Day of the Death? It just escaped my mind. Like, why are you not upset with the colorful Caribbean parade, but you're upset with the Pride Parade? So justice, if you position yourself on the right side of history, on the right side of society, and if you have committed yourself to human rights, you have to respect all the people who are different from you and that do no harm to others. They do no harm. Like a transgender person that dresses differently, that acts differently, who is he or she harming? Nobody, you know? That's my response.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
There is first a question. There are two questions. One is from Ellen to Leah, and then there is a question to Claudie again about the LGTB in America. This, I suppose, is for Delina. Now, first, let's go to Ellen's question. Leah, can you read it? How difficult is to be part of any youth and contribute in name of your country in a foreign country like UK, for example?
Sorry. Yeah, it's a very good question, because in theory it's not difficult at all. Formally it's not difficult. The UK is a very multicultural society. It encourages the participation of different communities, and there is this discourse where you have to you can both represent the country from which you come from and the country in which you are in. It's a very liberal, universalist, inclusive discourse formally. But the question is that I think in the UK and other countries like the UK, where political representation is driven by how many economic resources you have, it's obviously a lot harder from members of groups that don't have resources economically to actually make it. So there is a difference between formal participation and opportunities of voice and outcome. And so what I noticed, and I've especially noticed this in the last few months in Albania, in the United Kingdom, because there has been a rising campaign of anti-immigration against Albanians, is that I noticed that in the community, there had been ongoing discrimination for many, many years in the workplace. People didn't have resources, they didn't have opportunities and so on, but they were afraid to speak up because they didn't feel that there were enough voices in the public sphere that would actually represent their concerns and articulate their concerns. It's just a question of trust. Do you think that someone who doesn't come from your same perspective, ethnicity, history, social background, do they have the insight to actually be able to speak about you in a way that is representative of that community? And I noticed that when I started writing and saying, why are you targeting Albanians, or speaking out and kind of going in public discourse, that's where people really started to come out. And I was receiving literally hundreds of messages that said, I had this problem in my workplace, my son was discriminated in school, this other person, and people had never shared their stories because they didn't feel that even though they had the opportunity to participate and be local, they didn't think that they would be heard. And so, and unfortunately, the UK is a very, very entrenched, like a number of other kind of advanced capitalist countries, a very entrenched class society. So the people at the top who make decisions in academia, in journalism, in the arts, in politics, are people mostly from the British white middle class. So yes, there is the chance that someone like me every now and then breaks in and then brings a different perspective. But the dominant majority, the vast majority of people who actually have access and have opportunities and have resources are not from minority or migrant backgrounds. They're usually from kind of privileged backgrounds. And that's why it's very hard then for people who are in the minority groups and who want to feel represented to actually also feel understood and listened. And that's why it's also, I think, of it as a kind of responsibility that if you are from these groups and you do make it, then you really have a responsibility to defend them and to speak up on their behalf, because the margins are, yes, in principle, open to everyone, and everyone has a say and everyone can say what they want, but the capacity for influence is actually very reduced still.
There are two questions from related to one another. Two questions from Claudie for Delina, I suppose. Can you read them, Delina?
Yes. So the first question is, what do you think about the introduction of education in school about the LGBTI groups in America, since we take an example from them? And then Claude is also saying, do you think that this should be a choice of the parents and not the system? Look, I mean, most school programs, curricula in countries that are democratic or pretend to be democratic, they include information on human rights. So learning about LGBTIQ community is learning about human rights. Also, it's learning about the society. They are part of the society. I mean, I'm sure each one of you has either a friend, probably there are LGBTIQ persons in this audience as well, but either a friend or a cousin or a colleague or a neighbor. So these are part of the society. So if we want children to learn about the diversity of the societies that they live in, they have to learn about the LGBTIQ community. And look, there've been studies. There is no, you cannot teach people to be LGBTIQ. You can. It's something existential. It has to do with your gender identity. You either have it, you don't have it. I mean, I don't know. People might experiment one night with same-sex experience because they want to try, but like people experiment with their sexuality, you know. But you cannot teach people to be homosexuals. So if you want children to learn about diversity in the society and human rights, yes, you have to have information about LGBTIQ persons and their rights. And the same way, because to the question, should we leave it to the parents? To the same way that we don't leave to parents to teach mathematics to children, the same way if your child goes to a school, then the child should be taught there about whatever things that she is taught about society and rights and development. So yes, the school should do this. I hope the parents also support what's taught in the school. That's my position, at least.
Thank you, Delina.
And
Yeah.
sorry, and I posted in the chat the links to these documentaries that have more information about LGBTIQ rights movement in Albania.
Justice, you have another question, I guess.
Yes, I do. Thank you very much, Bashkin. So my question is for you, Delina. So I'm really trying to understand the community because I'm trying to given my background, I'm trying to get more context. So my question, I watched a documentary recently about this, something similar to what you're discussing right now. So my question is this: given that you just said that human rights is up to it should be taught to everybody. So my question is this, because some of the ways that these people are teaching or passing across this message to children is a bit concerning in a way. So my question is this: what do you think is the right age to start teaching children about the diversity that actually involves in sexuality? Because I know when I started learning about sexuality, even though my country is a bit backward around teaching this early on, but what do you think, based on your experience in this space, that is an acceptable age, putting into context that these children are still very young of age and they're very impressionable? So what age range is it best to actually teach kids about their diversity options that are available to them?
Justice, I'm not an educational specialist, so I can't give you a straight answer. I mean, at whatever age they start learning about races and ethnicity and human rights, at that age, they should be taught also about the LGBTIQ community. And I wanted to say, because I was reminded about an example. Listen, if you committed to human rights, that's hard work. You have to work with yourself, because if you say and if you believe it, that you respect human rights of all people, you really have to work with your hidden stereotypes. We all have hidden stereotypes, but you have to acknowledge them and fight them. Because I'll give you an example. There is a very famous person in the human rights community in the United States. His name is Arya Nair. He was the founder of the Human Rights Watch, which is a leading human rights group in Albania. Sorry, in the world, not Albania, in the world. And Arya Nair made a name. I mean, he's Jewish. His family perished during Holocaust, during the Second World War in Europe. But he migrated and he grew up in the U.S. And there was a protest, a demonstration, a peaceful demonstration by right-wing groups in Washington, D.C. And there were groups that were opposed to it and were going to the mayor and saying to the mayor of Washington, D.C., you shouldn't allow them to protest. And Arya Nair, and these were Nazis, these were fascists who, I mean, the same ideology had caused the death of his family. And he came out in support of their freedom of speech, you know, and there was backlash against him from the Jewish community, but also from the human rights community. So sometimes respecting and protecting human rights of other communities, it's hard work and it starts with us, but there is no other way, because as we know, as the history has shown again and again, it starts with, oh, I don't quite like the way you dress. And it ends up with annihilation of the other group. I mean, look at like the law that just passed in Uganda. It's horrible. We have my program supports some transgender people. She was kidnapped and was robbed and was kept, I mean, like, and why? Just because she loves differently. I mean, what is she? She's a wonderful member of the society. She's an economist. She's a human rights activist. She's a peaceful person. She's a nice person. Everybody loves her. And only because she loves differently, which is her business, it's not the society's business, she was close to death. Only for that. So we have every time, like, because you're young and I was there, I've been there where you are, and I've learned many things in life. But every time you feel uncomfortable about the other, always instead of following that sense of uneasiness with the other, stop there and remind yourself, no, I have decided to respect human rights. And no, let me think, why am I uncomfortable with the other? And analyze yourself and try to stop there and work with yourself and support the others, even when they are not from the same community that you are, because that's how people hate. That's what people generate hate about Albanians or blacks or brown people or LGBTI people or disabled people or even poor people. There are people who hate poor people, who think that poor people are poor because they are idiots, you know. And so it's the same feeling for always. You have to fight with the temptation of hating or disliking the other, you know. So that's what I want to say.
Thank you, Delina. Any other question? Well, it's coming to an end. I would like only to mention that I consider quite significant, quite meaningful that on panel discussion focused on social justice, on social policies, we have been also talking about people who are discriminated because of their race or because of their sexual identity. Usually and quite frequently, which is something unfortunate, these things are considered separate, like either identity or minority groups who are discriminated or problems of social class. So it by itself it came that all these problems are related to each other in many ways. I would like to thank both Lea and Delina for their participation, and also to thank the people, the public who followed us, and for their questions and for their active participation. So thank you.
Thanks, Bashkin, for this opportunity, and thanks to everybody. This has been a very interesting conversation for me. And Lea, thank you very much for the opportunity to listen to your very interesting presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Likewise. Same for me. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you, guys. Have a nice day.
Bye.